Hello and welcome to this special edition of the ILEETA Learning Lab. My name is Joe Willis. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for ILEETA. And today I'm here with Matt Bloodgood. Now, he's presenting at the 2026 ILEETA Conference and Expo in St. Louis, Missouri, which is the 16th through the 21st of March. And his course is on training scars, which is an incredibly important topic. Training scars, ninjas, zombies, and smartwatches. Matt, I cannot wait to explore this title with you. It is one that's had my attention since I first saw it. So let's just jump straight into it. What are we talking about here?
Well, okay, so training scars, what are they? That's kind of the big question. And where do they come from? How do they develop? And to kind of answer that question, researchers Joel Suss and gosh, I'm always kind of messing up her last name. And I know they're going to watch this and they'll get mad. Gula Arsel. They started looking at the question last year when Joel was working for the Calgary Police Service. He was a police practices expert there. They're in the transition of moving to Australia right now because he's going to be doing, I think, something very similar for the Queensland Police. So they're on their way there. Well, they asked that question from a researcher, perspective, and what they did is they took a look at it and they found that there's not any real definitive empirical definition of what a training scar is. And when they started digging into it, they found over 30 different definitions of what a training scar is across multiple disciplines, such as healthcare, the military, aviation, and law enforcement. And so they set out to do an empirical study on training scars to try to come up with a very defensible definition, if you will. And so they started working on that. And I had some conversations with Joel about training scars, and we were talking about some things. And I want to say early summer, this is where the smartwatch part of the title comes into play. I'm watching a officer involved shooting video that was from the Midwest. And as I'm watching the video, it was a split screen, and you had, the in-car camera, and then you had the officer's body camera. And I'm kind of watching the officer's body camera because I'm trying to see it as much from his perspective as I can, even with all the limitations of body cameras. And as I'm watching, I notice him do something with his hands. So I've got my inert little training pistol here by way of example. And so he's in a low ready position, and he's right at the door of the suspect vehicle. Now there's two suspects involved here. Both of them were involved in a felony battery on an officer up in Illinois, and they just happen to be down at this gas station. And he's giving commands. And then if you want, we'll play the video in class, and you'll see he'll say, show me don't move, show me your hands, don't, that's another issue altogether. But what he does is he goes from a low ready position, and I've obviously got to bring it up because of the camera. He takes the pistol, puts it in his hand like this, rolls it over, does something with his watch, in the middle of this event, and then comes back and gets back into a low ready position. When I saw that, I was like, holy crap. I mean, that's the definition of a training scar right there. Where is it coming from was the question. So then I started paying attention to people in classes with watches, and I started trying to pay attention to my own actions when it comes to a watch, because I wear a Garmin, and I get alerts on my watch from my Ring security system and stuff like that. And I started catching myself in the middle of a presentation doing this, and I'm like, this is self-directed behavior based on a device. And so I sent that video off to Joel, and then, like anything else, once you become aware of something and you start paying attention to it, I started seeing training scar stuff popping up all over the place. And, based on kind of the loose definition, if you will, or features of a training scar, because, having conversations and looking at some of the feedback, because when they started doing this study, they were interviewing, I'm probably going to be off on these numbers, but they were interviewing over 180 law enforcement instructors and academics from, I think it was over 20 different countries. So I know there were some Canadians and definitely some Americans that were involved. And so so I'm seeing a lot of this stuff, and you start to see some patterns that we're starting to develop. And so in their preprint, that they were working on to kind of explain the parameters of the study, there were a couple of things that popped out in these things. So a very loose kind of definition, well, I shouldn't even say a definition, but features of training scars are typically they're unintentional, they're potentially dangerous habits that have these types of features. So, and they're caused by training that's not realistic, doesn't replicate real world conditions. Um, they can be caused by distrust of the culture or the environment within an agency, the working conditions. It could be driven by administration, by culture, by tradition. For example, we have a video that will present that has a state police officer from a Midwest agency in the middle of a high risk felony stop where the suspect vehicle literally rolls backwards and make contact with the front of that officer's patrol car. He gets out, goes to the rear of the vehicle. A couple of other officers join him. And then you see the officer in question come forward, open up the driver's door, lean in, come back out, and put his hat on in the middle of all of this. Okay. And so I got an opportunity last fall to interview a couple of police officers from that state about that video. And what they told me is that that particular district where that officer worked was notorious for them looking at traffic cameras and in-car cameras and stuff like that. And if you weren't wearing your hat, they'd write you up. So is that a tradition, if you will, that comes in a price of blood? So we have to kind of ask those questions. What's the reason? Why did that occur? Other stuff that can happen is learner expectations and their experiences, what they bring into a training environment. Poor training design. We're going to spend a lot of time in that class talking about instructional design and problems, and some of them that we're going to talk about, I'm just as guilty as the next person because I just didn't know any better. And so really driving home the point that you don't know what you don't know. And so you got to start asking questions and start learning these things and getting education. ILEETA is a really good example of an organization that you can meet with a lot of different instructors, get a ton of different perspectives, and start incorporating that stuff into your own education and training process. I mentioned self-directed learning with the smartwatch is one example. And then you have one-time learning. An example of that is a kid, we grow up, we put our hand on a hot stove, we learn right then and there never to do that again. And so we build in these instinctive motor programs, if you will. Your hand gets near something hot and you immediately pull it back. You don't even really have to think about it. You just do it almost at an instinctive level. And then there's some other causes, and we'll get into them in the classes. And so when we look at kind of the sources or where these things can develop through, there's kind of three broad categories. One is administrative, and I gave an example of that with the hat. That can also, when we're talking about administrative, we could be talking about antiquated ideas related to training and equipment. It's probably about 8 years ago now. I'm aware of a sheriff that got elected, came into his office and basically wanted to dump their patrol rifle program, sell all of their AR-15s, and switch over to lever action rifles. And yeah, that was kind of the same response. People start going, "What?" And asking questions. And I dealt with a sheriff because part of my previous careers, I was a regional training coordinator for Idaho Post. Worked for the Anchorage Police Department prior to that, doing tons of instruction, and retired as an academy supervisor from up there. And so part of my job was dealing with instructors, assessing them, giving them feedback, working with the agencies to find training. And I have a brand spanking new firearms instructor, very motivated. And he calls me up one day, super frustrated. He had just graduated from the instructor program. We're about a month or two afterwards, and he's trying to get his agency to do some more training. And the sheriff essentially says, "You got all the training you need at the academy, just go qualify." And those types of attitudes can create a lot of problems. Idaho, by way of example, started with a phone call from a sheriff to one of my cohorts and asking the question, "Hey, can I run something by you?" And it was a situation where he wanted to terminate a deputy who'd gotten a crash. And the question was, "Well, when was the last time you gave him EVOC training?" He goes, "Well, I got EVOC training at the academy." Well, when was that? 26 years ago. So these some of these administrative driven issues, I get, the money and the equipment, I get those issues. They're very real. And so how do you kind of work around those kinds of things? Back to this by way of example. I mean, this thing right here off of Amazon when I bought it was $60. Okay, those are going to be a cost. But if you know somebody who has a 3D printer, you're not super worried about the durability. You're just using it for demonstrations and things of that nature. I printed off before a class that I did last week. I printed off a Taser X7. It's in orange, and the total cost of the filament was about $3.
Right.
So so it's just learning how can we work around these problems on the administrative side. Then you've got instructor and kind of instructor related, instructor driven problems, anywhere from instructors taking in, law enforcement is notorious for copy cut paste culture, and so they'll take a lesson plan, just copy it, put their name on it, and just go out and teach it without really taking a look at what's in that lesson plan. And for example, I was looking at some lesson plans just over a year ago from an agency out on the East Coast, and the most current court citation they had in that lesson plan was from like 1997. And this was a lesson plan that was being presented in 2023 and 2024. And I go back to my experience in Anchorage as a new officer, new instructor, and just being beat to death over Weaver stance. Everything had to be modified Weaver in firearms. Nothing else was acceptable. If you did anything else, you did it wrong. Front sight focus. If you even talked about point shooting, you'd get yelled at. And so now here we are today with a better understanding of gaze action coupling, with those with red dots and being target focus versus front sight focus. All of that stuff really has to change. We have to have some serious conversations about that. And what's really ironic is you can go back into the 30s and find writings from Dick Fairbairn about the second you start putting medals and ribbons and scores into your firearms training, people are going to start slowing down. I mean, this was written back in the late 30s. It was published during World War II. And then you just kind of fast forward it to Rex Applegate in the 60s and 70s talking about the same issues. And when did we get away from it? Well, Matt's opinion is we started getting away from it when IDPA started. And all of a sudden you started putting trophies and money, sponsorships and all this other stuff towards firearms training. And what was the end result? Everything started slowing down, became about accuracy to a point where I think it was overemphasized. In fact, you can find videos, and I was just watching Colin Knorr from the NRA talking about over-aiming video today. And so we have those issues. We have instructors that come up with drills, exercises, whatever you want to call them, or scenarios, where they're just wholly unrealistic. And this gets into kind of the ninja and the zombie aspect of the training, but you could also throw trunk monkey in there, and there's a lot of other stuff you could do where officers are put in no-win situations that are completely unrealistic. It's like if I'm going into a call for service or a scenario and been there, and it's like, well, you're going to go into this place and there's 4 people in there that are armed. No, not.
Am I going in? Yeah,
Why
exactly.
would I go in?
Right.
Exactly. So it's like, well, it's just part of the scenario. You got to go in and do all this stuff. It's like, why? If I know I've got four armed subjects inside of a building, why would I go in? That's where I'm going to hold a perimeter, get some more people dressed like me, and then we'll take care of business. But it's things of that nature because you go in. The zombie side of it is an officer will deal with a particular threat, and the threat will go down or do whatever, and then the officer will pass by, and all of a sudden the threat jumps back up again and starts nailing them. Again, is that realistic? Yeah, you can find examples. Okay, 10-second rule of gunfighting by way of example. In Seattle PD had a shooting a couple weeks ago that was kind of an example of that guy coming down a sidewalk, took several hits, went down, was down for a few seconds, and if guys get up, and this is where again instructor-driven problem comes in because you see this in YouTube videos all the time, is they'll set their own timer, they'll hit the timer, they'll shoot really fast, and then they immediately holster and start looking for this timer. Could that manifest itself out in the real world? Sure, because we see it. And if those officers had been trained or self-taught or were directed to do something similar, that guy goes down, they think the fight's over, they immediately holster. Well, it wasn't over. It was a couple seconds later, the guy rebooted the computer and got back up, and they're back in a second fight. I think it was in Georgia a couple years ago. Two officers confront an armed subject with a knife, and they end up backing all the way down into a highway. And the suspect compels the one officer to use deadly force. He does. The guy goes down. Fortunately, he didn't holster, but the problem was the dude still got up, still attacked the officer, and turned it into a hostage situation that the second officer ended up having to deal with. And so we've got to be mindful about what are we doing in our training, equipment wise, otherwise. I haven't decided if I'm going to show that one from Georgia because I just don't know if it's necessarily a training scar issue. But I've got a video from a large metropolitan police department in the state of New York, somewhere near Manhattan, that you have an officer who's holding on to a suspect who's in handcuffs. And while he's doing that, another guy grabs him. Second officer's got a radio in his hand and tries to engage this suspect with a radio in his hand. And throughout the whole thing, in the video, I slow it down, we'll actually track all of the different directions he goes with this radio. And at one point, literally switches hand with it and then continues trying to struggle with this guy with a radio in his hand. So we have that. Then I've got a couple of videos of examples of officers that are messing around with gloves, in the middle of stuff. And in all three of those incidents that I have, the subject in those had a knife. And in two out of those three, officers got stabbed. And so here it is, the officers are messing around with gloves. And it's like, is that a training scar issue? I think it's probably on the fringe. But if we know officers are going to wear gloves, then we should be training them when to put on the gloves. We should have them train with the gloves on. I dealt with an instructor at a university program who forbid his students from wearing gloves on the range, period, flat out forbid it. And I said,
is that a training scar?
I think that's an administrative.
I mean, I guess, as I've heard, like there's so much good information, and I haven't interrupted you at all, which those who know me know that that's quite a feat for me. But I'm just fascinated by a lot of what you've offered here. But when I hear something like that, these hard and fast rules that are counter to what operationally we're going to do,
right.
That seems to me, and I really enjoyed. Unfortunately, I didn't do phase 3 of Joel's project, but that research project and what he's putting out on that is phenomenal. And this is going to be, I mean, the pre-report is just an incredibly powerful document as it is. But as this gets peer reviewed and what goes on with that is just going to be groundbreaking. It's going to change how we do things. But I hear something like that to me immediately screams training scars. when we have a hard and fast rule that is policy driven or administratively driven, which you've talked about, that is directly contradictory to operational. Is
Yeah.
that, I mean, that's a pretty good example, right?
Yeah. I mean, could you make an argument that that's not a training scar, it's a training issue? Okay, if we really want to split hairs, yeah, sure, we could do that. But I think what it does is it creates problems because, officers, I come from working in Alaska, living in Alaska for 35 years, 21-year full-time job with them, and a couple years as a reserve officer prior to that. And I spent 18 and a half years of that on the street. Winter, 5-6 months out of the year. And then for the last half of my patrol career before I got promoted, I was working downtown Anchorage, high crime areas. We were dealing with crackheads and hookers and vagrants and you name it. We were dealing with it. I was in gloves all the time.
Summertime, even, yeah.
Even in the summertime.
What's the difference? Oh, I'm sorry. What's the difference between, as you just described there, training scars and training issues? How would you characterize that?
Okay. It's kind of a hard one because, a training scar is kind of this unintended behavior or habit that could have dangerous consequences. I mean, that's kind of the direction that this definition is going. It's going to have some aspect of that. In fact, I think in class, I'm going to ask people, give me keywords that you think a training scar is, which if you participated in part of that study, then that was a lot of those types of questions. Yeah. And so I think it's really tough to say. I think this is where having a really cohesive definition will help because you can stand back and go, okay, yeah, that's an unintended consequence of this training or this policy. How many times have you seen a policy that comes out and you got instructors are looking at going, okay, how am I supposed to train this?
Right.
How do I pressure test this? How do I operationalize this policy through training? And then, I mean, this is where stuff can really get deep in the weeds. When I really started doing some serious work on this and getting involved in a couple of criminal and civil cases, what I found was linguistics and how we say things and the definitions behind words really matter. To the point now where I'm actually reading books on semantics and pragmatics. And my wife thinks I'm nuts, but we've got to understand if your policy says, this thing is defined with these terms. Okay, well, as an instructor, if I'm looking at this going, okay, these terms, they're all subjective. So how am I supposed to teach? And I'll give you an example. From a police agency, large agency on the East Coast, that the definition of de-escalation included communication, tact, empathy, instinct, and sound tactics. Okay, so tact. You look at the definition of the word tact, that is going to be subjective. And that's like as a supervisor getting complaints about, well, this officer was rude. Okay, what did he say? Well, it comes down to, well, it wasn't what he said, it was the tone. Right? Tone of voice is subjective. I mean, how do I, as a supervisor and as an instructor, how am I going to teach that? Now, I'm sure somebody will send me an email saying, well, this is how you do it. Same thing with empathy. But if you look at empathy, empathy is kind of like mirroring somebody's, feelings and personal experiences. Well, what happens? How do you teach somebody to be empathetic that's never had a death of a family member or those types of things. So it really, kind of kicks open a door of some levels of complexity that if you don't have enough time to train now, what are you going to do with that? How do you train instinct?
Well, these are all great questions. And I think, literally the ones you've just given, these three in a row here, they beg the bigger questions about what are we doing with the time we have available. Before the recording started, you and I were talking about if I knew this person I was training was going to be in a fight for their life tonight. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's one of the series of questions that I ask, especially new instructors. And if I'd have been asked these questions early in my instructor career, I would have, I think, avoided a lot of the traps and pitfalls that I fell into, doing some of the very things that we'll talk about in the class, going, hey, let's not do that, right? And that is, am I training to reality within the confines of safety? If I'm not, then why am I doing it? And then the second set of questions is just that. If I know with 100% certainty that my student is going to get in a fight for their life tonight, would I train them differently? Well, if the answer is yes, then why am I not doing it now?
Yeah.
And so in really taking that and looking at this, and here's where I can buy a fight, guaranteed. But I've got a lot of very hard-hitting instructors, and some of them that'll be teaching at ILEETA in March. They'll say no more than 5% of your firearms training should be live fire. So if that's true, then what should we be doing? And I got into some spirited discussions, if you will, with some firearms instructors here. And I said, look, if we change one constraint on the range, which is remove live ammo, and we put in either marking cartridges or blanks or run airsoft with nothing in them, what could you do on the range? You know, and so a lot of times people will sit there and they'll think about it for a minute. No, you know, they'll usually toss out the word, well, scenarios. And I go, okay, well, here's another way to think of it. If I have live fire, everything has to go one direction. If I take live ammunition out of it, I remove that safety constraint problem, and I put in blanks or marking cartridges, now I can open up 180 degrees of the range or 270 degrees, depending on the range development design. So now what can I do? You know, and so that opens up a huge door, because the decision to turn on the trigger finger is far more important than running the trigger finger. Again, probably buying a fight, but that's the reality. And how often do we spend time training people? Look at the vast majority of what firearms training looks like today. You're standing at a prescribed distance with a prescribed number of shots at a target that is non-threatening, that is not moving. How much decision-making is involved in that? Listen for beep, count your shots that you were told to shoot, listen for beep. That's all the decision-making that's involved. And yet, what is a real gunfight, for lack of a better word? What does that really look like? And you know, I've suggested to instructors, videotape your firearms training. Then take video of shootings at your agency, put them side by side and go, okay, which one, you know, is the real one? And so which one should I actually be training for?
And this applies across all domains. I mean, we've talked about
Sure.
firearms, but I mean, you could transfer it to defensive tactics. You could transfer it to interpersonal communication, right? I mean, you gave the empathy example, and there are tons of things that we could be doing more realistically. And I think you hit the nail on the head with within the confines of the safe limitations that I have available. Am I training as realistically as possible? And some would say that as open as possible, that the outcome should drive the training, that we should be focusing on the ecological dynamics and all of these different training methodologies. But at the end of the day, you would probably agree that there's a space for that. There's a space for the actual technique, but within the confines that we have available, as safe and realistic as possible is what I've heard you say.
Yeah, that's the thing. Back in September, myself and a number of other people got the opportunity to go up to the SENA instructor course up in Calgary. That was Dr. Cushion and a couple of guys brought in, and you know, they started. I mean, class started 15 minutes later. We're on the mat in scenarios, starting out with what they call silent movie, which is essentially like if you and I were going to do this, one of us would be the bad guy or the subject, one of us would be the officer. And let's say you're the subject, and we do this entire thing. My job is to calm you down and not say a word, and you're not saying a word, and it's all through body language. it felt really awkward at first, but then once you started doing it, it started making sense. It's like, okay, how can I help you? Just
Right.
simple gestures and body language, all the way up to we started getting into defensive tactics scenarios. And one of the things that I took away from this is, when we end up on the ground with a subject, we got there because of one of three reasons. Either I, as the officer, took them there, the subject took me there, or one or both of us slipped and fell, or tripped and fell, and that's how we ended up there. So instead of starting on the ground, start in one of those positions. Now
A
you can dial,
realistic, safe position.
yeah.
Yep.
So dial the intensity way down. All right. So we minimize the risk of injury. And let's say, and you're the bad guy, and you just decide you're going to bear hug me around the waist and take me to the ground. Okay, we do that. We just do it with a very low intensity so we don't get hurt. Now we're on the ground in something that is a lot more ecologically dynamic, with some constraints, and then we start basically kind of going through, and technique does not have to be perfect. I've gotten way away from perfection in technique. A couple of years ago, Idaho Post went from you had to pass the defensive tactics test with a 100% score. So essentially you had to be technique perfect, to now where they're at. Hey, as long as you can get the handcuffs on, somewhat looks like what we want you to do, and you can do it without you or the bad guy getting hurt. That's what we want. Great. And so it's just kind of a difference in perspective and how you go about that training. And so other things that we picked up is we're using focus mitts and just low intensity smacking, they get people in the head to get used to the idea of being punched and things. And so instead of, like, so much of my training is, okay, we're going to do this really super slow, static, and it was all technique oriented. And if you were off, somebody would come up and go, no, you have to have your elbow right here. You had to do this. You had to do this. And I think in a lot of ways we are coming well forward in training, starting to understand that. Word's starting to eke out slowly. I don't know. I think it's more going to be on the next generation of folks coming up behind me, because I'm not going to be doing this forever.
But you're setting conditions now. And I think that's, as we come to the end of this interview, and Matt, I'm looking forward to the conversation at ILEETA, and I would like to continue this with you, hopefully in a follow-up interview after the conference, because there's so much that we didn't get a chance to talk about today. And I feel like we barely scratched the surface on so many great things, which is just another indicator that with the time we have available, well, this isn't an ad for a class specifically, right? Like, that's not what we're doing here. We want to give value, and we want to help people understand and make informed decisions about what classes to go to at ILEETA. The reality is, with the time you have available, that conversation is going to be so rich. There's going to be, I heard some great video examples. And while we're still evolving the full definition of what a training scar is, and I think that's going to be the best outcome of all of this, is as this continues to evolve with what the research they're doing, we'll get a better understanding of it. But I think at this point, as you're going to show in the class, we know well enough that there are things that we're doing. And you said something earlier that you may have done some of these things inadvertently, not knowing. But like Maya Angelou said, when you know better, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. And I think that's the point we're at now. Many of us in this space, yourself especially, trying to take us to that point. And so as you set conditions for the next generation, I hope they're in your class. I hope they're there to be a part of this conversation, because there's certainly some great, rich conversation to be had around this. And I think some aha epiphany moments of, shoot, I didn't even realize I was doing that. It's time to do better.
I'll stand up in front of the class and go, look, just about everything we're going to talk about in this class, I'm guilty of doing myself. So,
yes, sir.
And why did I do it? Well, because I didn't know any better. One of my mentors in firearms, was, phenomenal firearms instructor, phenomenal shooter, but he was very dogmatic about certain things. And, and so I'm taking that and I'm going, well, he knows, so I'm going to do what he tells me to do. It wasn't until I really started taking a look at things, and probably one of the Defining moments for me. I mean, I could spend 10 minutes on other, things that just started building up, but stuff was building up, building up, building up, building up. And then one day somebody showed me the video of the invisible gorilla. Had to be about, I want to say around 2006, 2007. Now I've been a firearms instructor for about 5 or 6 years by this point, and I saw that video, and then I went out and I got the book, and I read the book, and I'm just like, holy crap. A lot of the, some of these problems with the illusion of knowledge, illusion of confidence. I mean, that's me. And then when I was in the academy as the supervisor, I got that book and I had, gave it out to my staff. I didn't make them, I didn't say you have to read this.
Sure.
But I said, I really want you guys to read this book. And I think that's what really started me down this path of realizing I don't know what I don't know. And because of that, am I hurting my students as a result? And those were some pretty eye-opening moments for me. So
awesome. And I think that's a perfect point to end on in this interview. It's run a little longer than some of them, but I'll be honest with you. Like I said, I could have listened and kept listening there. There was so much good stuff in what you offered. I'm looking forward to the next part of it. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today on this special edition. And I'm looking forward to getting you back on a full edition of this eventually for this topic specifically. You mind sticking around? I got a couple other questions for you after the interview ends.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the opportunity to come on and have this conversation. Really trying to, crunch this into 30 minutes is not possible.
No.
But yeah, I'm looking forward to the future conversations on it.
Awesome. Thank you.